Hi, my name is Bethany. I'm an analyst with the government, and I have a question for Ms. Shinn. You talked about China's political objectives, or you talked about China's economic and security objectives in Africa. And I wanted to ask about China's potential political objectives, especially because we heard this morning from Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield that in her discussions with China, they have, most recently in December, they've left open the possibility that they would want to get involved in the domestic political affairs of African countries. And so I'm wondering, first of all, what are China's political objectives in Africa, if it has any? And secondly, what tools does China have to pursue those objectives, especially since we've heard from a number of speakers that China, unlike the US, doesn't attach the same kind of strings or conditionalities to its aid. So if you have any thoughts, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you for the great question. In terms of China's political objectives in Africa, there are a couple of categories. The first one is always Taiwan. And Beijing does compete with Taipei for the recognition as the sole government representing China. And before 2008, China and Taiwan did engage in quite intense checkbook diplomacy, competing for diplomatic relations with African countries. I think currently there are still 3 African countries that maintain diplomatic ties with Taiwan. The second political objective is China would like to solicit African countries' support for China's multilateral agenda or political agenda at multilateral forums. So we know that 54 African countries constitute a fairly large voting bloc at UN. So when China has an agenda at UN, it would like to have African countries on its side. Then it's an intriguing academic question and a policy question as well as for whether China does try to promote its own model, its political system. A combination of the Beijing consensus, a combination of the political authoritarianism and economic capitalism. In the case of Africa, it's very difficult to verify this with a Chinese analyst or with Chinese officials. Although in private conversations, they do convey a sense of the existence of non-democratic countries in Africa, and hopefully their prosperity could serve as living evidence that democracy does not have to be a universal value, and China is not necessarily alone or isolated in the international arena. The question of non-interference on African countries' internal affairs, we know that's a principle of Chinese foreign policy, although that position has also been evolving. And the biggest question the Chinese would ask internally in their policy deliberation is, well, we don't want to interfere in the internal affairs of another country, but when the internal affairs of another country interfere with us, we have to do something. And South Sudan is a great example of this concern. Currently, the Chinese draw a distinction, a very clear distinction, at least in their policy playbook, between intervention and interference. So in the Chinese concept, intervention, especially those with UN mandate and with the local government consent, are regarded as legit. So when China participates in the UN peacekeeping mission and sending combat troops to Mali or South Sudan, the Chinese don't see that as interference of another country's internal affairs. Then the more strict definition of interference in other countries' internal affairs, it has several criteria that either is unilateral intervention by a country over another sovereign country without that sovereign country's government's consent, or it is it does not have UN mandate, or it is economic sanctions that's imposed unilaterally on a country to coerce a country in a certain policy direction. So I would say that when the Chinese do their policy deliberations, they do have quite a clear definition of different categories and to justify their side of the story. Thank you.
If I might just add, although it's an economic interest rather than a political interest, China clearly wants to have access to Africa's oil and minerals, natural resources. On the political side, though, I would suggest there's another concern that is a more recent one that does fall in the political security arena, And because of China's growing physical presence in Africa, sheer numbers of Chinese who are living there, the estimate is somewhere between 1 and 2 million, who are there either temporarily or living for extended periods of time. Chinese are encountering the same kinds of negative developments and problems that Westerners encounter or anyone else does. For example, you fall in harm's way. The narcotics trafficking becomes a question. Terrorism attacks become an issue for Chinese nationals as well as everyone else. Money laundering, international crime, this whole negative basket of things China very much wants to avoid. It had a peacekeeper killed in Mali just a week or so ago. It had 3 senior Chinese executives who were caught up in an attack on the Radisson Blu Hotel in Bamako, Mali last year. So it's interested in avoiding all of those negative kinds of things, just like the United States wants to avoid.